I'm Tanu Sankalia, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for tonight. On my left here is Marlo Andre Hudson, who's an associate professor of city and regional planning at UC Berkeley's College of Environmental Design and associate director of the Institute of Urban and Regional Development. Marlo is also chair of the Urban Studies program at UC Berkeley. His research focuses on strengthening community development and improving sustainability to address the inequalities that exist in cities today. Blaine Merker, on my far left, is the director and team lead of Gale Studios in San Francisco, where the team bridges design and research to plan cities for people. He was co-founder of Rebar Art and Design Studio, which merged with Gale in 2014, which is an urban design studio dedicated to promoting interaction among people of different backgrounds through creative design of public spaces and installations. So feel free to take a look at tonight's flyers for their full biographies. So thank you, Marlo and Blaine, for joining us tonight. It's a great pleasure to have you on this panel. Our panel today is called The City of Tomorrow. And this is not meant in a techno-scientific, futuristic way, but in a way that addresses the question of how cities can be made more livable in the context of rising inequalities and increasing divisions. In order to dig a bit deeper into this question, I want to first turn to an article published in 1996 in the Journal of the American Planning Association. It was titled, "Just Cities, Growing Cities, Green Cities, Urban Planning and the Contradictions of Sustainable Development." And the author, Scott Campbell, identifies what he calls the planner's triangle. At the center of the triangle is our goal of achieving what he calls green, profitable, fair, sustainable development, which I think is an objective that is shared across the political spectrum, or at least it should be shared across the political spectrum, and one we can all agree on. And its three corners are the drivers of development. So you have economy, environment, and equity. So economy, environment, and equity. However, as we develop our cities, the economy, the environment, and equity are prone to conflicts related to private property, the use of resources, and development itself. Individuals and corporations assert their rights to develop private property. The worst case scenario is the laissez-faire model. While the need for economic growth puts pressure on the use of natural resources, and development can often benefit wealthier communities at the expense of poorer minority groups. The question then is, how do we balance the three corners and resolve conflicts in achieving our goal of sustainable cities? Now, after Campbell's piece came out 20 years ago, in 2016, Arcadis, a design and engineering consulting firm, and the Center for Economic and Business Research, CEBR, published a report called Sustaining Our Cities, a part of which was published actually in the May 2017 issue of the National Geographic. So if you get your hands on it, check it out. There's a excellent kind of a table which actually shows you all the many, about 100 cities in the world and how they fare on these three indices. The report establishes an index of sustainability and takes into account three factors: profit, the planet, and people. So very much like economy, environment, and equity, which then ranks cities to show how sustainable they are. The report and the rankings point to how cities across the globe have dealt with and continue to balance these three aspects of livability and sustainability. For instance, take the city of Dubai, which has prioritized economic development and growth and addresses later factors of people, equity, and the environment. So it's sort of front-loaded economic growth, and that's happening in China as well in many instances. Now, I'm not tied personally to these ranking systems because they can produce false hierarchies. And I wish if we had a set of 100 cities, I wish they were all in the top 5. But these rankings do end up reflecting certain historical patterns, such as the differences in cities in the global north and the global south, the rich and the poor, which are apparent when one visits Copenhagen and Kolkata, for instance. In these rankings, Zurich and Copenhagen are numbers 1 and 4, respectively, on the list. Vancouver is 23, San Francisco is at 39, and Mumbai, or Bombay now Mumbai, where I was born and raised, is way down the list at 92. So my question, as planners, urban designers, and community organizers, how do we approach the goal of creating green, profitable, and just cities, or what we now call sustainable or livable cities, by balancing the aspects of economy, environment, and equity, or its mirror, which is profit, planet, and people? And I want to turn this question over to our speakers and ask them, how are you approaching this question through your work in city planning, in urban design, and community engagement, both locally and globally? So perhaps we can start with you, Marlo,
Yes.
and then go to Blaine, and then we can sort of talk about this a little bit.
You have to love how serious these questions are, right? So I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invite. I think when I look at my own work, so my work is really at the intersection of development and health. And so most of my work is at the community development level, working not only in the US, but globally. I'm doing quite a bit in South America, primarily in Chile right now. And one of the things I've been most interested in understanding is how do you create wealth through city development, but also how do you address issues around inequality, much of what you just discussed, Tanu. So in my work, I've lately been focusing on our housing crisis. So if you look at a place like the Bay Area, obviously we all know the cost of housing and what it's like. And then if you get to the solution, so I like to be solution oriented and say, well, how do we address this issue? And you quickly run up against a number of problems, right? So obviously cost of land, resources, what role do cities play in regulating land use, and so forth. But if you look at it from a practical level, a level for the everyday person, they'll say, I want to be sustainable, I want to be green. You see this movement back to cities, so certainly we've moved beyond the urban crisis of the 1960s. We've had the restructuring of our economy to a knowledge-based, information-based economy. Silicon Valley, the Bay Area represents that, one of the leading places in the world for knowledge-based jobs and so forth. But at the same time, for the everyday person, they're having a hard time surviving, right? So if we look at from an economic perspective, on one level, we have a tremendous amount of jobs being created at the high end, so high-skilled, high-paying jobs. And in the middle, we've had the hollowing out of the middle class, right? So you could look at San Francisco as being an example. San Francisco has a high concentration of high net worth individuals. If you want to know what high net worth is, it's $30 million or more. So San Francisco has, so you're just wealthy if you have 5 million. High net worth is, real money is 30 million or more, right? That's the kind of world we're in. So they're the San Franciscos of the world, the Londons, the Paris, Beijing, we know the cities out there. But what does that mean for the people who don't have those jobs or may not have the skill set? So you have the hollowing out of the middle class, and then you have a tremendous amount of jobs being created in the sharing economy, or you could call it the exploitative economy, depending on your perspective. People have 2 and 3 jobs, sometimes more, whether it be driving for Uber or Lyft, doing TaskRabbit, Instacart, working as a barista. We all know how people are trying to survive. And in my work, recently published a book looking at gentrification and neighborhood change within San Francisco, Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C. And this trend is happening everywhere, where you have this bifurcation of the labor market, rising housing costs. And so at the state level, we're saying we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We want people to be sustainable, be able to take transportation to their jobs. And in fact, what you have are people moving further and further away from the urban core because they can't afford housing. And our commute times are actually increasing, not decreasing. Mm-hmm. So that brings up a whole bunch of questions of if we are serious about balancing all three, economy, equity, sustainability, how do we address this from a holistic perspective to not just say, San Francisco, you need to build your fair share of housing, but say housing is really a regional issue. And not to pit, pit ourselves against each other saying, well, part of the housing crisis has to do with all of these tech sector people coming in, the tech bros, it's their problem. And in fact, it's much more complicated than that, right? There's nothing wrong with creating wealth. The question is why, if you decide to live in San Francisco or you commute to Silicon Valley, why can't we get there easily? Right? Why? So then people direct their anger towards Google buses, and I understand the challenges there of buses using public system and so forth, but the fact of the matter, many of these buses take cars off the street. So the analysis of students at Berkeley have said the typical Google bus takes, or any bus that commutes down Silicon Valley, the bigger ones, take about 120 cars off the street, right, off the highway. So the bigger issue is how as a region, and this goes for many regions, I could say this about Santiago, Mexico City, London, Paris, grappling with the same issues of this inequality, these growth patterns. So how as a region do we come together and say, what's our vision? How do we articulate that vision? How do we engage all citizens in the democratic process? Because I think when you start talking about poor people, certainly looking at women in this discussion, we talk about rising housing costs, the bifurcation of the labor market, we don't talk about the gender inequality tied to that. So women moving further away, not spending time with their children, commuting 2 and 3 hours, and that's everywhere. I talk to colleagues around the world, this is everywhere. So how do we articulate the vision that we want for us as a region to say we want to do well in all 3 of these things? How do we do it? How do you engage at the local level? Because once you're out of sight, you're out of mind, right? So if you're wealthy, you come into the city or you live in the city. We're increasingly not being next to each other. If you choose not to deal with certain people, you don't necessarily have to. So in my work, I'm very much interested in the metropolitan fragmentation that we see, basically looking at these larger metropolitan areas, these mega regions, and how you have cities that either partner with each other or don't, whether it be around transportation, which is a regional issue, housing is a regional issue, education is a regional issue, and beyond. Now, there's a local, there's certainly a place for local development, and cities should have some control, but we'll talk about that later. I think that's enough for now. So,
Blaine, you want to jump in?
Excellent setup, and it's getting me thinking. I think, in thinking about those 2 frameworks that you mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that struck me about it is the move from the 90s, talking about this sort of very conceptual framework of balancing ecology against social justice against economic development, to what sounds like a more people-focused approach, and that's very much in line with how we practice. And so I'm a practitioner, I'm a designer, I'm a landscape architect by training, and a sort of doer by inclination. And though I really believe and respect the broader planning scale and the sort of the economic factors that are just out of sight for most people, or the larger social dynamics that shape our cities. For me, the practice every day is about sort of what does it look like for individual people on the ground, and how is their day impacted? You mentioned commute times. How do people have to sort of contort to make it work in today's economy? How do they have to rearrange their family lives? And really, what is their experience sort of the city physically? And again, as my training and disposition as a designer, it usually comes back to some sort of engagement with a physical solution to a human experience problem. And it's not by any means the full solution. It's a part of it, but it's kind of engaging with that relationship between the physical built environment and people's experience. And the reason why this is interesting to me is because I think it comes down to the idea of externalities, and I'm not an economist, and so I'm just sort of borrowing that term from economics, but this idea that you can have a negative effect somewhere outside the system that you're operating in. It's an externality, you don't have to worry about it. And the city actually doesn't have externalities in some of the ways that we're talking about. If there's a freeway that goes in one neighborhood and it displaces people to another neighborhood, there's no externality if those people stay within the city and their quality of life is impacted negatively. The externality of having increased mobility is felt inside the city. Or if it's not and you go to the region, you start seeing that externality in increased commute times and someone coming in from Antioch to take a job in the city. So for me, the human experience, like looking through the lens of people's lives, is a way to catch those externalities and make sure that they're not being just sort of put into some other geography or some other person's problem, because they always show up. They always show up as a negative impact on someone's life. And so I guess I sort of I mean, I believe in the study of ecology and a scientific assessment of, you know, urban systems and ecological systems. But I think at the end of the day, if you want to just capture human impact, it's a pretty good way of catching a lot of other impacts too. So we talk about public life in our work at Gale, and that's kind of the metric by which we measure all of our success in our work. And what I mean by public life is sort of what people do outside of their home, workplace, and car, what they do in the city together. And I think the quality of that is sort of an indicator species in a way of a lot of other things going right. So if you can manage for a high quality public life, people being able to coexist, appreciate each other, have access to one another, have a pleasant life moving through the city, enjoying their everyday tasks in public as they move through the different poles of their lives, you're actually managing for a healthy social fabric, vibrant economy, a sustainable transportation infrastructure, and often a sustainable ecology as well. So it's sort of the indicator that we use to guide our work. And I think the thing that I'm particularly interested in lately is how the city becomes a locus of interaction between people. Especially now as we sort of have all of these reasons to be more physically separated from one another. How does the city, how does our public realm connect us together? And even if we're not engaged in some face-to-face interaction with each other, just the mere presence around each other, being confronted with difference, being able to witness each other's lives sort of front row is really important. And so lately in our work, we've been looking at how different cities invite for that and how we create public spaces that support it. It's not something that can be forced to happen, but when the conditions aren't present, it doesn't. So a couple of projects in particular I'm thinking about right now that really focus on that. The first is we're working in Buenos Aires in a currently a slum district. It's an informal settlement, sort of right in the heart of the city. It's called Neighborhood 13, Barrio 31, Barrio 31, and it's been a kind of an enclosed area that urban development has sprung up around, and it's like an island in the middle of the city. What's really amazing about it has an urban scale that's basically medieval. It was developed at a human scale, sort of incrementally, and we have started to work with the city of Buenos Aires, who has a pretty noble goal, I think, of starting to formalize that neighborhood equitably and to not displace a single household except where it's necessary for the safe removal of some old infrastructure, and to upgrade the city services, to underground the utilities, to provide safe streets, and upgrade every individual dwelling in situ, like while the folks are continuing to live there. So one by one, they're starting to provide structural reinforcements to the houses. The architecture teams are drawing plans of every home that has been hand built. And what we're trying to do is we're focused on the public realm. We're trying to figure out how to upgrade the public realm. And this is something that the neighborhood really wants. They want to participate in the fabric of the city. They want the same amenities, the same quality of paving, the fountains, the public spaces that the surrounding neighborhoods have, and not lose that human scale and that kind of really intense, vibrant public life that's been created there. And it's a humbling experience to work there because we're trying to disturb as little as possible and still be really serious about the effort of upgrading it. So we're starting with a public life survey, so where we observe really closely and quantify how people are using the space and use that to inform public life outcomes that we would like to see, and that to inform the basis of design. So not really starting with the design, but starting with the public life first. The second project that is in my head right now is in the city of San Francisco. We're working on the Civic Center and starting a public life survey there. So Civic Center and UM Plaza. And I'm sort of also humbled and a little afraid of that task, because we all know Civic Center has a lot of issues. Right. But what it really inspires me about it is that, this is setting up a city process to eventually redesign Civic Center, and the design doesn't work. And it doesn't work for a lot of reasons, both physical and also social and cultural and economic. And there's a scale issue that there's problems that are at a scale larger than Civic Center that impact it. But we are embarking on this intense study of the public life of Civic Center and trying to understand what really goes on there and what the invitations are for people, lots of people, all people, to stay. Lots of people move through it, but very few people spend time there. There is one bench in all of Civic Center and UN Plaza, and it's part of the temporary installation by the Exploratorium. Wow. So we'll be working on that this spring and into the summer to set up the design process. And I think what really is inspiring me about it is to think of Civic Center as a place where people can come together, as a stage where San Francisco can see itself in the mirror and engage in this kind of ephemeral, hard to pin down concept of civic life together, and really see the diversity of all of our residents, all of our citizens, and the people who live around San Francisco who have to commute in, as a way of strengthening our culture, our political culture. And we'll be doing that over the next few months. So we're always looking for sort of ways that those projects can inform each other. Because we're practitioners, we're informed by theory, but we, essentially just need to figure out some things that will work within the project that we're doing. So we're always looking for ways that our work in cities like Buenos Aires can inform work in cities like San Francisco.
And Malo, in your case, are there any specific case studies or projects that you're working on which you can sort of talk about how you are dealing with these diverging and converging issues, the framework that we kind of identified?
Yes, very much so. Very similar to Blaine, I have a project in Chile, so I'm working with the Ministry of Housing and Urbanism, and they're concerned about the lack of integration of various classes within the country. So on one level, you have people just like us, just as educated, just as connected globally, and then you have people who are not part of that economy or not part of that life. And one of the projects I'm working on is about 3 hours south of Santiago in Talca, a community called Las Americas. And it's about 5,000 people. In Chile, this is something we could talk about the US, but in Chile they have social housing. Housing is a right for people. And so Las Americas has gone through some rough times, so the idea is that we would renovate the social housing and not just focus on the actual physical housing itself, but actually engage residents in the process. So one of the things we're doing, it's really a 3-step process, is to do an assessment, very similar to what you've talked about, do community engagement with residents, look at community capacity, to talk about what are their conditions, what would they like to see, and then do a baseline study of what are people's economic opportunities now, what do their social networks look like, what is their health status, and once they go through this renovation, to see if it's actually improved over time. But beyond the physical aspects of it, it's also focusing on the actual sustainable layout of the environment. So connecting them to better transit, improving water connections, improving the environmental pollutants that are in the air and in the water. So you go there, you'll see young people playing in very polluted waters and things like that. So the idea is that this would be a pilot project for the country, and then it would move across the entire country doing this type of redevelopment process. I also want to touch on, in the book I was talking about, I've looked at these 4 cities, San Francisco, Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C., and I was primarily interested in, as I said before, neighborhood change, or what people call gentrification. And I wasn't concerned who the gentrifiers were, how do you measure it, but I was concerned with how are people surviving? How are people making it? So you have people doubling and tripling up. And I just wanted to get their voices and their stories. And one of the things that resonated with me, and which Blaine just also mentioned, is the need for space for people to come together and have these conversations, right? So cities matter, place matters, the world's becoming more urbanized, cities have a tremendous amount of political power, the economic power, they can go beyond the nation state and sign on to environmental treaties if they want to, and all of that's incredibly important. But if people are not able to stay in their neighborhoods or able to participate in the democratic process, what does that mean? And I find that people are talking past each other. There's a lot of anxiety, and I think we do need these kind of plazas in the public realm for people to interact, to engage. And one of the things I want to learn more about and think about is, what are the institutions and organizations that could play the role of convener? Right? We know that there's a lack of trust of government. There's a lack of trust of just the media. I mean, who can you trust? Right? And we're talking about just in the US context. I'm not even talking about globally. And so where are the opportunities to get people to engage with one another, to have dialogue around some of the things we're all grappling with, right? To say, well, why is the middle class shrinking in many cities? Why are people struggling? Why isn't there family housing being built? Why, when you do see housing being built, or these cities like San Francisco or New York and whatnot, it's a tremendous amount of international capital. We have a lack of housing being built overall. We have a number of regulations and things in place to try to protect people, but oftentimes you see developers or others going around that. So how do you hold cities accountable to be transparent, responsible, and all those things for the local residents? And all too often you see city governments providing subsidies to very wealthy investors or developers, and that's fine if there's going to be some return to community, right? There's going to be, what's the benefit to the overall public? Whether that be investments in education, infrastructure, all of these things are incredibly important. So I think cities are globally play a tremendous role in our democracy and in creating good quality of life for people, at least the opportunity to do so. But I see these challenges. And so in Chile, we're trying to address this at a small scale and then build it up to more of the regional scale. And in the United States, just looking at the 4 cities, in my book, I see a lot of parallels across these cities in terms of the challenges that they face.
So maybe should we talk maybe a little bit about the Bay Area, since you started off with that, and sort of bring. I don't mean to sort of keep dwelling on this notion, but I think that we began with the idea of economy, environment, and equity. And if we just take that as a framework and apply it to the Bay Area, and we even take a sort of a ranking system and see, okay, if Tracy is a city and so is Oakland and Berkeley and Mill Valley and Palo Alto and of course San Francisco, how do they rank? Where do they fare in this whole idea of equity in terms of environment, in terms of economy? So for example, San Francisco is very high on profit, but is it as high on people? And so how can we address that, and especially because of housing? I mean, Tracy and Antioch and the outlying suburbs, as we know, have been sort of eviscerated in terms of housing, especially after 2008. So how can we address these issues of the 3 E's or the 3 P's in the Bay Area through the kind of work you do, community engagement and policy, or through design, as kind of stuff Blaine does? So maybe, Malo, do you want to reflect on that a little bit, and then Blaine can?
It's a great question. I'm not into rankings of cities
Yeah.
that much, but no, I get you. But I am into framing issues, having a broader discussion, bringing people into the democratic process, as I've mentioned. And if you look at the Bay Area, just from an economic perspective, it is a tremendous economic engine. You have, literally thousands and thousands of jobs being created in Silicon Valley all the time, very little housing. San Francisco oftentimes is seen as the place that needs to build more housing. Globally, people say San Francisco. I went to New York, I went to DC, and they all said, we don't want to be like San Francisco. We don't, they call it the San Franciscanization of our city. I never thought I'd hear that from the East Coast cities. And, on one level I understand what they're saying, but on another level it's incredibly unfair to the city of San Francisco, because San Francisco could not build enough housing if they tried to meet the growing demand. Then the real question is, then why is Silicon Valley so quiet? Why is Palo Alto, Cupertino, Mountain View, all of these cities so quiet? Because it's an elected official's dream to have the jobs, but not the housing, the traffic, and the schools, and all the nightmares that come along with that, if you see it from that perspective. But instead, why are we not having a conversation that says, we as a region,
Right.
we say we're very progressive, so we as a region need to address the big issues. Go to any underpass, and you see families that are homeless. Go to some of the areas that are not the most desirable, and you'll see people living in terrible conditions. We have students at the University of California at Berkeley that are living in their cars. So at some point, as a society and as people, we have to say, we can do better, We must do better, but what does that look like? How do we come together to have these broader conversations that says, yes, let's create the jobs, absolutely create jobs, but let's also look at income inequality and then think about the need for broader, better housing, better transit, right? If you think about some of the challenges, I'm embarrassed when my students come from Asia because they'll come to me and say, Professor Hudson, like, I didn't imagine the transit would be so bad, our infrastructure is so bad. I go to Chile and the infrastructure is incredible. It's not always bad, but their infrastructure is pretty good, right? And so you say, what is going on here? And you talk to people about taxes, right? Don't get people started on California, we pay a lot for everything. And I think people are starting to say, well, what are we getting in return for that? And so let's have a broader discussion. You can't put everything out there, but I do think we need to say jobs are being created in Silicon Valley, but there's very little housing being created.
Precisely.
So let's have a regional conversation. And then if you talk to electeds in San Francisco, as I have, they'll say, look, Malo, if we say Palo Alto, Oakland, or pick whatever city you want, you're not building your fair share of housing, the headline the next day in the New York Times and globally will be, San Francisco is not building their fair share, or refuses to build.
It's sort of lobbed back into San Francisco's court.
And so at the end of the day, we have to start to say, well, how do we benefit? And if you asked me, I would say there would have been a tipping point a long time ago. What's the tipping point, right? Where there's so many jobs being created, not enough housing, costs are so, the people just say, I'm not coming there anymore. I thought that would have happened a long time ago. And in fact, people are still moving here. People are paying arm and a leg to live here. But what are the environmental impacts of that? Right? So on one level, we have Senate Bill 375 that says let's reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. You have AB 32, improving air quality and all those things, and trying to build, really both of those bills trying to focus on transit-oriented development to be more dense in our development. And in fact, we don't have the same pool of money for affordable housing around these transit stops. People want to live around transit. People want to walk. People want to enjoy the nice mixed developments that you see in a city like San Francisco, but not everyone can afford to do so, so they are moving further away, and we're just leading to more gridlock. And what does that mean for our agricultural land, our water, our air quality, people's mental health? We haven't even talked about the health impacts of this type of development, or lack thereof. I know, Lane, you've alluded to some of this, but it really is about people's quality of life and their well-being and the future generations.
Yeah, I think for me it comes often down to the transportation and land use nexus, and the opportunities that people have close to where they live are artificially shaped by this kind of subsidized private automobility, and that's what we still have put our bet on in the Bay Area. And the outcome of that is some really sort of grotesque situations, I think, where you have folks who can afford to live in an urban walkable environment, maybe in San Francisco, and then commute an hour away to a suburban environment because that's where the jobs are. So to me that says, hey, there is actually a problem of a shortage of good walkable urban environments in places where folks who do that work and can afford to have it live. Wouldn't you much rather have that environment close to where you actually work so that you don't spend an hour in traffic? Although the shuttle's pretty nice, but there are externalities to some of these ways we've worked around the transportation problem. So my feeling is we definitely have to think about it regionally. We sort of push up the profit score in one place, and it's actually pushing down the human experience in another place. There's no escaping it. I mean, the region is maybe the sort of the closed system that we choose to focus on because it's where people can commute. So again, as a designer, I just kind of keep coming back to the basics. I mean, what the guide star is for me, which is, what is the composition of someone's day? What is the composition of everybody's day? If there are folks whose day is, 12 or 14 or 16 hours long because they have to have two jobs and a super long commute, and then they still have to go, take care of their kids and shop and everything, that is an externality of someone else's opportunity. So by sort of looking at those life snapshots one by one, I think you can start to put together a picture of where you need to solve the problem. So I'm particularly interested in the Bay Area. I would really like to see us just going to say I'd like to see us create high-quality, dense, livable urban environments in Silicon Valley. People will still choose to live in San Francisco and commute because it's got history and it's super interesting. But I think there is a latent demand there that could relieve some of the displacement and gentrification pressure in other places.
And San Jose is sort of a potential capital of Silicon Valley, right? I mean, it's been for a while. I mean,
Yeah.
And sort of related is can we actually start thinking of the Bay Area not as just a region, but actually call it a city? I mean, it is in a way, an expanded city. And another thing is, I don't know how many planners there are in the room, but there's this whole idea of the sort of regional planning, which is a kind of a process that goes back, a tradition that goes back to the 1930s. Lewis Mumford was kind of one of the leading lights of regional planning. And with regional planning, the idea was that an entire region came under the sway of one master plan. But I don't think we are talking about that anymore. And, rightly not. And the idea is that how can we think of each city having some kind of autonomy, but what's happening is that I think each city is asserting or exerting too much of autonomy, in a way, and not picking up its fair share of housing and other infrastructure that it contributes to a larger area. And so how can we start then thinking about putting more pressure or creating different ways that we can improve this whole livability aspect by thinking about this whole region as a single city? And very few people are completely kind of isolated in a city like, for example, Oakland only, or Berkeley only, or Emeryville only. People are spread out. I mean, so many of their you're going to San Francisco for something, or maybe the South Bay for something, and so on, the North Bay. And let's not forget that almost 70% or almost 80% of the land in the Bay Area has already been saved as greensward. So our ecology or our environment index is very, very high. I mean, no other region in the United States has access to open space like we do, right? But we're obviously suffering. Profit is also up.
Yeah. But
there's the equity aspect that's taking a pretty bad hit. And so I guess, we can maybe look at examples from other parts of the world. I mean, Chile is one that you mentioned, Buenos Aires is one, and of course Europe is always the example that we're forced to look at in terms of bringing some of those ideas here.
Well, I've done some consulting work in the past for the Canadian government, and in Toronto, they're growing at a rapid rate. So they call it the Greater Toronto Area, the GTA. And one of the interesting things about Canadian cities is oftentimes, we have a lot of autonomy here. We could raise taxes as a city, you could do certain things. But those decisions oftentimes are decided at the provincial level. So in the case of Toronto the provincial government of Ontario would then dictate some of what they can do. But at the end of the day, there was a conversation in Toronto to say, we are growing at a rapid rate. We have the suburbanization that's happening. We're concerned about our traffic congestion. And so they created more of a metropolitan governing council, not necessarily a government, but a governing council to come together to have these kind of conversations about education, transportation, the environment, water, infrastructure. You can go on and on. And I think that what we need in the United States, and certainly you see this in Europe, as you mentioned, Paris has the Grand Paris Plan that they're working on now. We'll see how that turns out, but it's a broad plan to connect transit and job centers, as you were mentioning earlier, Blaine. And so in the Bay Area or in any of the major regions, we have obviously state level government, we have local government, but we never envisioned, at least at the founding of our Constitution and our government, that we would need a regional governing, I hate to say this, regional government, because I don't think that's the answer, but some kind of governing body, regional body, to address some of these broader issues, right? So if we're thinking about climate change or the environment or just mitigating the effects of climate change, it has to be from a regional perspective. So you have cities that have their own climate action plan, which is great, but it's not as though pollution stops in one city and doesn't move on to the next, right? It's silly to think about that. Cancer doesn't really care, stress and all these things that people are doing. It doesn't matter. It affects rich, poor, black, white, green, purple. It doesn't matter. So the question is, how as a region do we have these conversations? And I go back to the importance of institutions and organizations and organizations like we're at tonight to have these conversations, but bring people together and say, what is it that we want to see? How do you involve people in the democratic process? We're at the heart of technology here in Silicon Valley, and yet we're still having problems around voting, getting people involved in the democratic process. How can we can go out to outer space and we can't ensure that everyone's voices are at the table? Not to say that we can't incorporate everyone's voice, but to be able to give some feedback, to engage. It's silly that as planners we have meetings and say we're going to have a meeting at City Hall on Tuesday at 4 o'clock, and you can sign a comment card and we'll get to you and you have 3 minutes. That's just silly. So what are the ways that we can engage for people from vulnerable populations, affluent people, people who are less affluent, and get multiple perspectives from multiple generations to talk about what the future should look like? And I think that takes real leadership. It takes courage. And I'll just throw this out there. I know that there are companies in Silicon Valley trying to do the right thing. They're trying to build housing for its workers. But the real question is, how can we bring the private sector to the table as well to say, what can you do to help this process?
Yeah, I think Toronto and Paris are great. Toronto is a great example. But the good thing about Toronto was that the inner core was never eviscerated. They didn't have the kind of white flight like we had in San Francisco and other cities in the US. Paris, the only one thing that I don't know if everybody knows, it's very interesting, is that the same area of San Francisco and Paris, if you compare it, they have 2 million people in Paris, and we have 750,000 or so, or a little more now in San Francisco. So, I mean, obviously we can have many, many more people, here. And so that's sort of macro level. But Blaine, I mean, coming back to some of the work you do, since we are talking about livability and sustainability, but especially livability, how can we also look at it at the micro level? So we've been looking at it, we've been sort of discussing the macro policy, region and so on. But in everyday life, I mean, the sort of practice of everyday life, as Michel de Certeau talks about. But how do you see us working at that level as well?
Well, I think it relates to that broader political culture, actually. I think there is a practice at the local level, the extremely local level of the block and the neighborhood, that helps teach people and helps keep people in practice with a sort of a political discourse at a larger level. So we have a great problem with having enough attention and time to really deeply focus on the content of collective action in politics. We're bombarded with information, but we actually don't have a lot of time to sit down and talk to one another and to really hear people from, with different points of view, and to be engaging with difference a lot. And we all know that there's a geographic sort happening in the country where we're starting to sort politically into different geographies, and of course online, the same thing is happening even more extremely. So the question, and we're all busier than ever before. So the question is, where is that connection happening? Because if we can't have that connection with our neighbor, we're not going to have it at the regional level. I actually think there's a way of thinking that's the problem. I absolutely agree. It's about institutions and convening, I think, the discussion. But if we can get there through sort of some new cultural habits, I think the governmental structures will follow. We can't shove it into a governmental structure that's not serving the culture. So I guess at the micro level, what I try to focus on is, like, how do we bring people together, on their block, in the public square, or at the store? Where are people going to maybe encounter someone that speaks differently than they do? Where are they going to kind of learn to not be afraid of an outsider and learn their name and develop a relationship with them, so that they might be more open to larger circles of community? And I mean, that's really kind of where we're at with regional government and regional cities, is that we're on the cusp of something that we haven't really experienced before in the history of urbanization, which is trying to think of these large-scale metropolitan areas as our community as well. Right. And that takes a habit of mind and an openness and a political culture to support it. So I think it can be practiced at that micro scale and designed for, and it goes hand in hand with that larger scale.
But do you think there's also kind of a resurgence, or there's a great growth in sort of and vitality that's now in the city as well? I mean, on the one hand, of course, we have a huge housing crisis, and we've got these problems. But on the other hand, do you think? I mean, you've done work before. I mean, in creating parklets, for example, and we see parklets coming up everywhere. So, is there do you see that from your own experience and from your own work, a kind of a renewed interest in street level activity and
Yeah.
and so on, which is, I know Civic Center is a bit of a disaster.
Civic Center is a whole other
other than that,
ball of wax. But I think absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned the resurgence of the city, the return to the city. So that goes with a return to a certain kind of culture and an interest in place, and an interest in sort of that density and diversity. What we found in for example, in the Plaza Park program in New York City, which we studied, that actually the little plazas, the street plazas that the city of New York was putting in the outer boroughs, were more used by lower income folks for creating community than the ones in the higher income neighborhoods. And actually, when you asked people, have you met neighbors? Have you seen people more than once in this place? Have you maintained a relationship with someone based on this little temporary plaza that the city of New York put in? People making under $50,000 a year were way more likely to say yes. So I think there's a way in which actually folks with lower incomes who have been living in the city have been there all along and using place to organize community. I think other folks now with the means are coming back to that, and when you see things like parklets, it's a way for those people to rediscover creating place in the city. And I think it's really fascinating and really heartening to see that, and we need to kind of come up with a lot more typologies like that, a lot more ways of engaging people to make the place they live.
So we've gone from the macro to the micro. We've talked about the aspects of environment, ecology, economy, and so on. So why don't we open up to the audience as well, and invite questions, and maybe you can join into the discussion and ask questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I am curious, you're disparaging of the Civic Center having just done 2 different marches in the last couple of months. Thank you. 2 different marches in the last couple of months, and how frequently I see the Civic Center used for that express thing of gathering people successfully. And yet, I suspect that what you're talking about is on a day-to-day basis. And what are the impediments of that? Why aren't they gathered? And I also suspect that that has something to do with those very low income or homeless people who congregate in some of these places and make it what it seems less pleasant for the rest of us to be there around the library or whatever that is. And that is a complex issue that I actually think the Civic Center serves us well as a large gathering place and a place that we look to, a focal point in the city. But some of those other elements inhibit us using on a day-to-day basis, and I'd like your comments on that.
I think you make a great point, and I think you're absolutely right that Civic Center does function extremely well for very large-scale events. And I think it functions well for marches. I've been to a lot of marches and big events at Civic Center. It functions well for the sort of weekly and monthly events like farmers markets and theater opera and kind of big civic events like that. And then there's this kind of tide of regular use in commutes where there's not much stickiness there. It just sort of flows through and people don't stop. So I think the problem with Civic Center, if I think you framed it very well, it's more of a problem that the bandwidth of different activity isn't filled up enough. It's operating only on a couple of bands. So if I were to frame the problem, it would be how do we understand that potential of the entire bandwidth, and then how do we provide more options and more sort of profiles of activity across it. But regarding the folks who are homeless, who have substance abuse issues, or who are maybe living in the Tenderloin, who use Civic Center as a living room because they don't have a lot of space in their own house, I actually think that the problem there is that there aren't enough other people there, and so that's all you see. And I would say, Civic Center is very big, and if everyone was present and felt invited, we actually, San Francisco obviously has huge problems that are, we're addressing that are bigger than Civic Center that cause that perception. But my feeling is the solution might be adding more people.
My question is twofold. First, is there a solution to the LA problem? I don't know if you brought that up already or not, but also, how do we prevent the Bay Area from being the next LA area?
You mean suburban sprawl? Is that what you mean by the LA problem?
And
okay. And
traffic all the time.
And traffic all the time, and
405.
driving all the time.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Malo, you want to?
So someone who did grow up in Southern California, LA is actually changing quite a bit. It's becoming very dense. I think that we did go through that period of suburbanization, right? They perfected it really well in Southern California. But I also see a big investment in downtown now, investment in other areas. There are multiple cities, or city centers, I should say, in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. So I do think LA is starting to green itself, believe it or not. And I have a colleague down there who used to be the deputy mayor of the environment, Ramel Pascual, and he says, Malo, you should write the next book on the greening of LA, because actually they're investing quite a bit into transit, into walkable neighborhoods, into the downtown. It's actually getting to an issue that Tanu and I also raised somewhat is, if you look at Los Angeles County and the initiatives around public transit and the money that's been raised, the initiatives that have passed to raise money for transit, and then go next door to Orange County and see how they're investing in there. So you have this mismatch in Southern California. But I would agree, traffic is a problem in Los Angeles, and as soon as they shut down one of the big freeways for construction, they call it Carmageddon, and it doesn't happen. It didn't happen, right? And so then you ask, well, where did everyone go? Did they just stay home? What happened? I think if you keep feeding highways, they'll continue to grow. And I grew up in Southern California. That's probably why that is why I became an urban planner, because I didn't really like my lifestyle being poor and growing up in the Inland Empire. I think the bigger issue with the Los Angeles of the world and many places like that is, from an environmental perspective, what the impact is. You have a tremendous amount of people and very little water, and the kind of growth that you see way inland. So these are county decisions that are being made, but if you go into Riverside County, San Bernardino County, and other places, big lawns, big houses, 3 and 4 cars, and and I'm not here to, I have my own moral ideas about these things, and I can talk about it from an economic and environmental perspective, but people are choosing that lifestyle for a reason, and so we have to understand what that reason is. But it's not sustainable. It just is not sustainable, and when you have 6-bedroom houses and so forth, what's the point? It's great you have a Prius or a Tesla in your front yard, but what's the point, right? So I think we have to have a conversation about, what does sustainability really look like? How do we think beyond just ourselves? You look at Canada, and certainly you were talking about European cities. There's this idea about good governance and the people beyond yourself, community, right? Not just the individual, but the community. And growing up in Southern California, I can say this since I'm from down there, I think there is it's changing, but there is the focus on the individual so much. People are in their cars, they're in their life, they're the stars of their world, and I think you have to start thinking about what impact that has on the whole population. And then let me just end by talking about income inequality and spatial patterns. Because if you want to address some of the sprawl, you have to address income inequality. Just look at the east-west divide in California, right? You could look at Southern California. It's been documented very well by a number of scholars, and certainly the New York Times did a great piece on this a few years back. But along the coast, it's largely wealthy. It's largely white and Asian. Inland, it's largely darker and poorer. And that's a problem, because people are moving inland. We know what the conditions are like. You're talking about walkable communities or lack thereof. So what are we doing as a state to address some of these issues, right? So that's, yeah.
Yeah. And then back there later.
So I think we have like a general idea of what needs to be done in San Francisco and many other cities. Increased housing, better transportation, et cetera, et cetera. But when we try to implement these, these seemingly simple solutions, it gets blocked, right? Even from the inception of BART, when it was originally planned to go into Marin County, Marin County said no. And probably the same for San Jose. And even recently, a plan to increase housing in the Mission got blocked by a bar because they were afraid of a little shade. So basically, how do you propose we solve the NIMBY problem, essentially?
It's a great question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know how we solve it, but I do know from work that we're doing in Vancouver that the problem is spreading actually. So even in places like Canada, and which I have this sense that things just sort of work better there with government. There was this group of planners from the city of Vancouver who came down last week, and they said it's headed our way. We have the same problems. I think there's I'll just speak from my perspective. I keep coming back to sort of cultural issues. I mean, we have a problem of a culture of no around planning, and it's about people stopping things and things not happening. And there's a real important, proud, great history in the Bay Area about saying no to stuff. And I want to recognize that, and I am thankful for it. I'm thankful for our beautiful headlands and all the things that, happened because people said no. Yeah. But I think that culture has kind of gotten lodged in an unhelpful way in our current moment, where we've developed a lot of outreach processes around kind of getting at certain times and in certain venues where it's comfortable for people to show up and say no. And it has to do with the way we communicate, the kind of graphics, often our whole EIR process. It engages people in really focusing on risks rather than focusing on vision and focusing on what people want to say yes to. And we don't often ask people, what do you want? What do you want to say yes to? So I think the planning process has to get better about asking that question. I think City of San Francisco is actually making some good strides in that direction. The city planning took a big risk in doing something like the Market Street Prototyping Festival, which was messy and scrappy and really interesting and a wonderful first try, I think, at a pretty promising direction, which is meeting people where they are. And the folks who showed up to that, because we studied it, were by and large not the people who come to the meetings. They were racially and economically and age-wise different than the profile of the folks who show up at the meetings, because they didn't mean to. They ran into it. So they were participating in a public process without intending it. And I think by the very nature of kind of putting some positive ideas and taking that risk and putting them out in the public sphere, we can sort of unlock people to say yes to more things.
I saw one hand back there, Lou.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could discuss how thank you. I was wondering how you could discuss how the triangle model tackles aging infrastructure, say BART being a really good example.
Wow.
Well, infrastructure is huge. And I think that if you have a choice of driving in your car and you say you're in a job that you need and you don't have the autonomy to make those decisions of, hey, I'll come in late because BART's broken down, or you're probably going to drive. You're going to go with what's the most stable way for you to get to work. And I think the problem with our infrastructure is that you have what I've discussed earlier, this sprawl that's happening. Our aging infrastructure is becoming more and more of a problem, and it's extremely expensive. And so I think if you want to get people out of their cars, or you want to start promoting the kind of walkable communities that Blaine is trying to do, and transit-oriented development, and all the things that we say in California we want to see, from an economic and eco-friendly perspective, we've got to tackle infrastructure in a serious way. That goes to our schools, our buildings, our bridges. It's frightening. It's frightening. I don't want to be an alarmist, but if you go around the country, our infrastructure is in bad shape because we did much of this building post-World War II, and we haven't done much since then because there are issues around taxes, Prop 13 and so forth, how you could raise a tax base, or just thinking about corporate taxes. So I know people feel like they've been taxed enough, but these infrastructure projects cost a lot of money. But it's really important, whether it be water, we're talking about moving water around the state, or conserving water, right? With all this rain, are we be able to keep it, or is it just turning to runoff, and so forth? So I think that's a key issue, and I wish I had a better answer for you, but that's a big part of the sustainability, the economy, and the equity piece. To me, it's all three. Infrastructure is a big part of that.
And it's interesting, there's another triangle actually. I don't know why I'm into triangles today, but there's actually transportation, housing, and environment.
Yeah, yeah.
So, if you want to increase housing, you have to provide more transportation, which is going to benefit environment.
Okay.
So, those three are extremely linked, and I think, if you really want to improve environmental situation, we have to build more housing and transit.
Yeah.
So there's no way out of that.
Thank you. On the flyer for this program, there was a paragraph about Copenhagen and what's going on there to increase interaction between people. I was just-
Can you repeat the? I don't know. Did everybody hear the question?
Yes, this is about the mention of Copenhagen. And,
Right.
And I was just wondering about successful examples around the world that you look to for some of the goals that we're trying to reach.
Yeah, and Blaine's the perfect person because Gail is from Copenhagen.
Yeah, so Gail's based in Copenhagen, and we started there with Jan Gail's work 40 years ago, and our main office is in Copenhagen. So I get a chance to go there fairly often. I'm obviously not Danish. I'm American. I'm from Oregon. Getting to know Copenhagen has been one of these really interesting things over the last few years to me, because it's a city where it feels really easy to just be in the city. It's walking and biking, of course, they're sort of effortless. I have a couple of young kids, and I look at the Danish parents just kind of smiling, moving their children to the daycare that's 2 doors down from their house, and it feels really different from my morning fire drill. So I have a lot of respect for the Copenhagen. I guess the seriousness with which Copenhagen sort of took the city, and they said, this is where we live, we're going to make it as nice as possible. We're going to try and make it as nice as possible for everyone who lives here to get around, and we're going to say that the city is our home. And it's not a theme park to be driven into, and it's not just a place to do business, it's where we live. And I think that the one thing I'll say about Copenhagen that's important to remember is it wasn't always like that. It was a car-choked city 40, 50 years ago, just like every other US city. And through slow experimentation and reducing parking, increasing places for people to be, removing barriers to have kind of good outdoor culture, they were able to move the city in that direction. So I think that was like a good example of saying yes. They also have a tremendously homogenous population with some large immigrant groups, but there are certain problems that Copenhagen isn't dealing with that we are, and but still a lot of great lessons to take.
Did they have pushback from people? They wanted to
Absolutely.
park, or-
But they also had the data to back up that the change was having a positive benefit.
I have an extreme example, Medellin, Colombia. So it used to be one of the most violent cities in the world, and the former mayor is actually at Berkeley now at my research institute that I co-direct. And Medellin has engaged with residents. They've built a metro cable, so metro cars for people to take down to the central city. They've engaged local residents, and they've really had a big turnaround. There's tremendous amount being written about these anti-violence measures, about investing in people who are impoverished. And so I would encourage you to look at Medellin, Colombia as an example of what they're getting all kinds of awards around the world about the kind of turnaround that the city has gone through. And it wasn't always easy. When you're talking about taking on drug cartels, it's always risky, but there's a good story there. So if you're interested, look at Medellin.
So I think we're out of time now. So maybe do we have time for one more question? Or okay, one more.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Going back to the Copenhagen example, actually, I feel like you have to take certain risks in those kind of city designs, something that's not necessarily been done before. San Francisco is doing a lot of new projects, like Treasure Island and the Central Subway and everything. But I feel like even though the design's there, they're not taking it the whole way they could. Like Treasure Island could have been a completely car-free island. You have a massive car park on the Oakland side or something, and no one drives there. And I think there's enough of a population that would have paid for that. Or the Central Subway. The entire Stockton Road is closed now, but the plan is to reopen that to traffic after the Central Subway is done. Instead, they could make it a complete greenway for walkers. And how do we try to get the city to think more on a bigger scale?
Well, I have an answer that people won't like, but politicians go with where the voters are. And if the voters demand it, I would agree with Blaine completely about articulating what you want. We are trained to talk about what we don't want, right? If I ask my students, what would you like to see? That's sort of, what do you mean you're not going to tell me what to read, right? So we're always taught to what you don't want. But in fact, if you want to be a great negotiator, it's going in, articulating what you want and what you would like to see and have a vision around that. And I think we have to do that as a society, say, this is what we want. And not so much, we know what we don't want, but what do we want? Do we want a family-friendly society? Do we want to take care of our vulnerable populations? Do we want to protect the environment? So what does that look like? We don't have to agree, and we certainly aren't all going to agree, but I think if you start to talk about what you want to see, I think people might say, hey, that's some vision. And I've been to many cities around the world, and I can tell you those that are doing great things have great leadership and people willing to stick their necks out there, but they also have a population or constituents who are willing to back them and support them in those.
Which is San Francisco in the 50s and 60s, right? But anyway, there's one more. There was one more question somewhere there.
Yeah.
Or, you and then the front. Yeah.
Actually, mine's
Sorry.
also for the Copenhagen.
Oh yes.
And any example that you guys have really talked about. You guys mentioned data and how it has been good for all these cities, but what are the actual dollar amounts? Like, what does it cost to really try and fail and really keep going to finally get to Copenhagen?
Oh man, I have
Or any other city.
I have no idea. But I'll maybe turn the question around a little bit and say, what does it cost to build a big piece of infrastructure and have it not address a vision? Like, what does it cost us to have freeways running through the middle of Oakland in some of the most walkable neighborhoods? What does it cost to undo some of the things that we did that were really big moves? I think it costs a lot more. I mean, I think experimentation is relatively cheap. It seems expensive at the time, and I think there are probably folks who see some of the more kind of temporary stuff happening in cities now that is sort of tactical urbanism stuff and at large scales and think that's a waste of money. This looks like a big just sort of marketing experiment or something. But I think it is incredibly cheaper to do that than to make a big move that isn't fully understood in terms of its social consequences. And I just will say, I am super concerned because we are entering an era where we have to repair a bunch of infrastructure. We've got to deal with climate change and adaptation, and we are about to spend as a planet and as a region a huge amount of money on infrastructure to deal with that. And we have no idea what the social consequences, the unintended consequences of that infrastructure building would be.
But it's often an ongoing process too. I mean, people just think that there's nothing. Like, look at Doyle Drive, right? I mean, I just drove on it, a few days ago, and it's astounding. I mean, it's a huge project, and it's connected. The Presidio from above. At Crissy Field, and so it's. I guess there's a lot of projects that are constantly in the pipeline. But anyway, there's one more question there. The gentleman with the beard, and then we'll wrap it up.
So I guess this is kind of a tech bro perspective on things, but I think one of the things that's particularly challenging is that now we have the ability to communicate and to construct our experience of the world in a personalized manner. Not only can we choose how we experience the world, but we can also choose who we share it with in a manner that has historically not been the case. Before, I think you were forced to interact with your neighbors because that was the only form of communication available to you socially. Now you can, there's an example of, at a concert or something, you'll see people kind of recording on Snapchat or whatever, and at a similar event, somebody in the crowd said, guys, we're all here live and looking at it through a screen. So I guess my question is, as a human being, when I'm walking outside leaving this event, I'll probably put on headphones and immerse myself in my world and shape it the way that I want to. But the opportunity cost of that is that I'm, losing the ability to socialize. And I think that's kind of a human conflict. And right now, I think everybody is choosing to take the individual customized approach as opposed to being social because that's more comfortable. I guess kind of getting both of your perspectives, because I think it touches both of what you said. From a human perspective, I want to have the personalized world, but I know that these costs exist. How do you design around that, and what's like kind of a more macroscopic approach to solving that problem?
That's an excellent question. It ties into, I think, the NIMBY question as well. If you look at metropolitan areas, I do a lot of work around fragmentation, basically looking at the number of jurisdictions in a particular area. So if you take the Bay Area, for instance, we're 9 counties, just over 100 plus cities, and everyone's doing their own thing for the most part. And if you then take that down to the individual level, you just described the big problem. So what's bringing people together? How are we bounded as a society? How do we connect around humanity and just on the human level? And I think we are really going to struggle with this because people are plugged into the kind of media that they want to listen to that just reinforce their own opinions. And you don't have to live. If you certainly have the kind of money that people have these days, you don't even have to deal with anyone really that's not like you at all, except when you want to, right? I don't know. That's a serious question you've raised. It's something I'm grappling with in my own work and in my practice as well. So one strategy I've taken on is let's improve the planning process. Let's improve our democratic process. How do you really engage? I think it's a problem the way we go about engaging people in any big discussions around development, because people, it becomes, this is too big. You're talking about a big infrastructure project. Look how long it took to build the Bay Bridge, to rebuild the Bay Bridge, right? 25 years, 26 years. It's incredible. So how can we improve the community engagement process, the citizen engagement process? How do we bring people into a process that's more meaningful and engaging? And I think you see a difference. There are people who work with young people. I work with young people all the time. They love to engage if you give them an opportunity to do so and they feel like they have some stake in it. I think right now for a lot of people, it's, well, government is a disappointment. It doesn't matter what your political party. I'm not being just partisan here. I'm just saying in general, it's disappointing. You can't trust your institutions. So you turn inward and you turn to the communities that you create for yourself. And I think at the end of the day, though, we all suffer, right? Because we do want to interact. So I don't know. I wish I knew. Put your phones down. Look up. Look up. Put your phones down and look up. Yeah. Unplug for a while. It's good. It's hard, but if you unplug, it helps. You actually walk without your headphones on. You imagine what you see things in a different light. You really do.
Except no one talks to you because they're all on their headphones.
Right. Exactly.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great philosophical question. I bet every one of us is struggling with this now. Like trying to put our phones down, thinking about, hey, it's a choice. I don't have to do this. And I'll just say that, we were talking to a car company actually pretty recently, and I was asking them like what they thought their biggest challenge was, and I was expecting them to say something about autonomous vehicles or I don't know, infrastructure. They said our biggest competition is from people not wanting to go anywhere.
Wow.
Right? That's scary when a car company says that. That you could get everything you need as a human being through some goggles, or your phone. So I think actually we as designers and practitioners and thinkers and planners, we need to address the issue of actually the spaces we've created aren't good enough. I mean, I put my headphones on BART because the inside of BART isn't good enough. It's actually a little bit depressing, and it's getting better. It's getting better all the time. But our streets aren't good enough. They're not actually inviting for us to do that. So I think as you've seen sort of a disinvestment in the public realm, broadly defined, you see people turning inward. I think those things they're related. They're related. They make people want to invest when there's investment there and it invites them in and it gives them something. They want to invest more. So I think one way of going about it is personal, right? And it's taking off the headphones and looking up. And the other way is social and actually starting, like paying forward the investment and offering that so that people want more of it.
Okay, wonderful. So on that note, I think we should close, and please join me on behalf of World Affairs in thanking our speakers, Marlo and Blaine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.